we have an interview with the man the New York Times called the most important intellectual alive, the most quoted living author according to the Arts and Sciences Citation Index, and the guy who Jello Biafra said if he was black he would have been shot by now. Without further ado, give you Noam Chomsky.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule for this interview.
Glad to talk to you.
Yeah. I'll just jump right in.
Okay.
You used the term libertarian socialist to describe yourself politically, and at one time described your beliefs or convictions as being anarchistic. What do you mean when you use the terms anarchist and libertarian socialist, and what's the difference, if any, between the two ideologies?
Well, both of them are pretty broad spectra, so these are not well-defined notions any more than any others of political discourse. But anarchism has meant all sorts of things, and the main stream of it, at least in Europe and in part here, has been part of the socialist movement. In the United States, it's often had a much more individualistic cast, but that's some special thing about the United States. The same is true of the word libertarian. In the European tradition, it usually just meant something like socialist anarchist, but in the United States, it means advocate of unrestrained capitalism or something like that, kind of the opposite. So the terms I'm using the terms just to sort of locate myself within a tradition, namely the anarchist, the libertarian wing of the traditional socialist movement, which was basically mainstream anarchism as well, the anarchism of Kropotkin and Bakunin and the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists and so on. In a general sense, all of these movements have something in common, namely they believe that any authoritarian structure or relationship, whether it's the state or private ownership or relation of parents and children or whatever it may be, any relation of power and hierarchy has a burden of justification. It can't just be assumed to be legitimate. It has to demonstrate its legitimacy. And it has to demonstrate it by showing that something or other, like in the case of parents and children, you can try to demonstrate that children are better off if parents keep them from running across the street into traffic, let's say. Okay, that's an argument. But any kind of authority has to have a justification. Otherwise, it's illegitimate, and if it's illegitimate, which it usually is, it ought to be dismantled, and we ought to work towards a world of more freedom and more democracy and more participation and control, less obedience, less subordination to others, and so on. That's the general thrust of it. When you start looking at specifics, it goes in all different directions.
While we're on the topic of ideologies, it appears Newt Gingrich seems to be adopting a lot of the intolerance and the top-down decision-making structure of Nazi Germany. Is that a fair comparison? Or in other words, what differences, if any, are there between classical fascism and today's advocates of cutbacks, or in their words, structural adjustment?
Well, I think there are differences and similarities, and take, say, Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich stands for something pretty definite, a powerful state, a state that's involved in redistribution, but toward the wealthy. So you can see that he's leading away the effort to cut back any kind of government program that might help the general population, whether it's school children or future generations, like environmental concerns or working people or whatever. Those people are not his concern. Any programs that are for their benefit have to be cut back. On the other hand, he's very much in favor of government programs, strong, powerful government programs that put money into the pockets of rich people. So, for example, take his own district, which he represents, which is a good place to start. He represents Cobb County, Georgia, which is a very wealthy suburb of Atlanta. It's what he calls proudly a Rockwell world of jet planes and fiber optics, where people are supposed to be very conservative and all involved in entrepreneurial values and so on and so forth. Only one slight footnote, they're all on a federal handout. This county gets more, his district gets more federal subsidies than any suburban county in the country outside of the federal government itself. So it doesn't get as much as say Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, where the Pentagon is and so on. But if you move out of the federal government itself, he's tops. He's the biggest welfare freak in the country. And it's really easy to talk about entrepreneurial values and, get the nanny state off our back and so on, as long as it's pouring money into your pocket, as it is. His county, for example, is the corporate headquarters of Lockheed Martin, which is a state-subsidized corporation that makes the profits are privatized, but the costs are socialized. And he's right now pushing very hard for it to get a $72 billion contract for F-22s, which, according to Lockheed propaganda, we desperately need because of all these third world dictators all over the world who are getting advanced aircraft, and we have to defend ourselves. And who are they getting advanced aircraft from? Well, Lockheed, which is selling them F-16s at public expense, so that then we can build F-22s to defend ourselves from the F-16s that we're sending from them, meanwhile putting money into the pockets of Gingrich's rich constituents. That's jet planes, and it's indeed fiber optics, and it's computers, and so on. Mm-hmm. So the sort of thinking behind Gingrich is expressed probably most clearly by the Heritage Foundation. And just take a look at their budget proposals. They want to cut everything except with one exception, the Pentagon, which is the system that funnels public funds into the pockets of high-tech industry and its mostly rich constituents. It's a redistributive system that uses the federal government to maintain the state capitalist system in the interest of the wealthy.
Right. So you could call him a advocate of corporate welfare, but how does an advocate of corporate welfare today compare with, let's say Mussolini or Hitler of yesteryear? Like, are there any meaningful differences between the two systems?
Yeah, there are meaningful differences. Okay. But, these are not the same systems. They have some similarities.
Yeah.
The German state was strongly supported by major corporate power, though they didn't much like it after it turned out the Nazis had ideas of their own. And in fact, big American corporate power isn't so happy about a lot of the things happening now either. They're not happy about there is a strain in the Gingrich army, which is sort of right-wing populist, but that means they're also against big business. And they are against handouts to big corporations. And the big corporations, of course, don't like that. They also don't like the fanaticism. The Christian fundamentalism is something that scares them a lot. The corporate executives are mostly what are called liberals, kind of cultural liberals, like they're militantly pro-abortion. They don't want their kids to be forced to repeat prayers in schools. They don't like guys running around with assault rifles and so on. And insofar as that's a segment of the Gingrich constituency, they're very unhappy about it. Gingrich himself is they like a big business. Fortune magazine's run a couple of polls on this, and they love what Gingrich is up to. Because he's just pouring money into their pockets. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they don't like him, and they're worried about the people around him. Right. And that's somewhat reminiscent of the attitudes of big business towards the Nazis in the late 30s, but these are different systems. You don't want to draw the lines too tight.
Well, the similarities I was thinking were in the results, especially in the non-Western or non-industrialized countries, that basically a corporate state and a fascist state seem to be searching for Lebensraum and at the expense of many people's lives, and perhaps when you factor global warming and other unsustainable industries into the equation, it could be at the expense of everybody's life.
Yeah, but that's these are the interests of private power.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of independent of system. I should say that, these days, or after the Second World War, people think of fascism as being something that involves, gas chambers and death camps and mass slaughter and so on and so forth. But fascism as a socio-political system was pretty much admired in the West. Mussolini, for example, was very popular in the West in the across the spectrum. I mean, left liberals liked him. Franklin Roosevelt called him that admirable Italian gentleman, and in fact, the U.S. continued to support him right after the war in Ethiopia. Franco was very popular, Franco-fascism in the West. In fact, he even won years later, even way after the war. He was being praised by Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration and so on for the wonderful things he did. He was a straight fascist. Hitler Germany was very popular up until at least around 37 or so. The State Department, 1937, the State Department was advocating that we support Hitler as what they called a moderate, standing between the extremes of right and left, and if we don't support Hitler, we might have to worry about the masses rising up, and maybe with the middle classes supporting them and overthrowing the system that we like. There was no great opposition to fascism, and in fact, back in those days, you will find books by very mainstream American political economists, like, say, Robert Brady, a very good political economist at Columbia University, wrote a very interesting book, must have been around, 1943 or so, called Business as a System of Power, in which he simply described similarities among the various state capitalist countries of the world, Germany, Italy, the United States, England, all of which were adopting, as he pointed out, rather adapted to their own conditions and circumstances, but rather similar policies of trying to integrate state power and private power into fascist-like systems with different variants. It became unfashionable to talk like that after the Second World War, but there was a lot to it, and it wasn't considered very strange then. Brady, for example, is pretty mainstream Veblenite economist.
Yeah, it's a shame they don't teach teach the connections between our systems and classical fascism in elementary school.
Yeah, you can tell it by just looking at investment flows. After Mussolini took over in Italy and destroyed the parliamentary system instantly and instituted terror and destroyed the labor movement and so on, he was the absolute darling of the American business community. Italy, investment started pouring into Italy. I think it received the highest flow of investments probably in Europe in the 1920s. After Hitler took over, the investment flow started to shift to Germany. And in the 30s, Germany received more U.S. investments than any European country outside of England, where, of course, there are historic ties, reflecting general attitudes towards approval of what he was doing. Now, that was pre-Auschwitz, but it wasn't very pretty.
No. I wanted to talk about the responsibility, or perhaps the irresponsibility, of reporters and editors within the mass media. For example, the lack of any mention of the attempts of the Iraqi government to negotiate a diplomatic solution to the recent Middle East conflict. Has anyone done an analysis of this irresponsibility? A detailed
analysis
of let's say,
on that particular issue, or in general?
Well, in that particular issue first, and in general.
Well, on the case of, I'm not sure which case, what you're talking about.
I'm talking about the exclusion of
Iraqi negotiation offers after the invasion of Kuwait, or more recently?
After the invasion of Kuwait.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've written a lot about that. In fact, in my book, Deterring Democracy, which came out I had articles on it right away in Z Magazine, but then have written about it since. There's material on Deterring Democracy. There's more because more has come out in the recent book called World Orders Old and New. And the basic story of what happened is that after the invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein apparently realized very fast that he wasn't going to get away with it, and within a very short time, he was sort of leaking offers about a negotiated settlement, which would involve Iraqi withdrawal. At first, with various terms, toward the end, with almost no terms, and the United States didn't want this. In fact, its biggest fear from the very beginning, we know this now from internal materials that have leaked out internally, that the biggest fear was that Saddam Hussein was going to withdraw and leave a kind of a puppet regime in place, after which the whole Arab world would applaud, as Colin Powell put it in internal meetings about a day or two after the invasion. In short, that he would duplicate what the United States had just done in Panama, invade the country, leave in a puppet regime. The only difference is Latin Americans didn't applaud at that time. They screamed bloody murder about it. But essentially, aside from that, aside from the reaction, he would duplicate what the U.S. had just done in Panama, and the U.S. didn't want that. So they certainly didn't, and they certainly did not want to consider a negotiated settlement. So information was leaked about it, and it sort of was around the periphery of the press. The mainstream press wouldn't touch it. And in fact, till the end of the war, to the end of the crucial period from August 1990, the invasion, up till January 15th, the actual bombing the next year, that was the crucial period. During that period, the fact of the negotiations options was concealed almost totally, not 100%, but 99.9% concealed. New York Times, for example, or the Washington Post never reported any of it. It was pretty dramatic right at the time in mid-January. The polls were being taken all the time about the American opinion, and the last polls right before the bombing started, like about January 10th or 11th, showed the population by about 2 to 1. The preferred solution by about 2 to 1 was Iraqi withdrawal within the context of a general security, a general regional and global meeting about security of the region in which Iraq would take part. Well, the people who came out in favor of that didn't know that Iraq had just made that offer a couple of weeks before, and that high State Department officials had said it's serious and negotiable, and the U.S. had flatly rejected it, and the press concealed it. If people had known that, it wouldn't have been 2 to 1. It probably would have been 20 to 1. And the offer would have had to be pursued. Whether these offers were serious or not, we hadn't the slightest way of knowing. The only way you can find out if offers are serious is to try them. But Washington evidently feared that they were serious, and the press kept quiet about it. Now, that is one of the most extraordinary examples of press subordination to power that I know. And not only is it not reported, but the opposite is claimed. There is now book after book claiming that this period of leading up to the war from August to January was such a dramatic example of democracy in action, with all the options being considered and deliberated in Congress and so on and so forth. Fact is, nothing was being considered. The serious questions were being hidden. The crucial information was being suppressed. And even work that's critical of the media about the war generally glosses over all of this. They talk about much more trivial things, like the fact that during the war the press was restricted from observing combat on their own. Yeah, that's true, but maybe it's wrong, but it's pretty minor as compared with these things.
Was there any direct conflicts of interest between, let's say, the advertisers or the ownership of the New York Times and the Washington Post and their ability to, let's say, benefit from a military conflict in the Gulf? Or was it more informal structure of control, let's say, with the Washington press corps being manipulated by the White House or something?
Well, that goes into a level of detail which we don't have evidence about. Nobody knows what goes on the inside of private corporations.
Right.
They don't release documents.
No.
So we have to speculate. But what's interesting is that this pattern is highly consistent. It's been demonstrated. This is a pretty dramatic case of it, but the pattern itself has been illustrated in case after case. There's thousands of pages of documentation on this.
Mm-hmm. So nobody has made an analysis of, let's say, what advertisements appear in the New York Times or the Washington Post, if there's any defense contractors or oil companies?
Oh, yeah, you can do that, but it doesn't really tell you much. Like, for example, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the oil companies were in favor of a negotiated settlement.
Oh.
That's quite possible.
Right.
You know, these are things that you would know only if you had internal records. And remember, these are private tyrannies. They're not like governments. Governments have secrets, but at least, more or less democratic governments, bits and pieces leak out, and ultimately you get a fair amount of declassification. But you don't get declassification of records from Exxon. These are private tyrannies. These are totalitarian systems. They don't have any public accountability, and they don't tell you anything. That's why the Gingrich Republican types like them so much, because when you talk about the analogy to fascism,
mm-hmm.
the real analogy is private corporations.
Right.
Those are totalitarian institutions.
Yeah.
We don't use the term for them because our ideological system keeps away from economic power and structure. But if we were honest about it, we would point out that these are basically about as close to totalitarian as any institutions humans have devised.
Right.
Actually, if you look at their history, they came out of the same background as political fascism. The modern corporations were given their extraordinary rights and powers not that long ago. It's early in this century, and mostly by courts and lawyers, not legislation. And the thinking behind it, the intellectual background, is rather similar to what led to Bolshevism and fascism. And they're very similar in form. Totalitarian institutions unaccountable to the public, and very hierarchic and authoritarian in their internal structure.
So you would say that whereas some governments are semi-top-down with a little bit of feedback available, classical fascism and corporations share a completely top-down decision-making structure, and in that way they're similar?
Yeah, completely is too strong even for fascism, but very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, very much in that direction. Like, take, say, a corporation. Power is vested ultimately in the owners and investors. Control is done by the CEO and the board of directors. If the investors don't like it, they kick them out. The rest of the structure is very strictly top down. If you're somewhere inside that system, say a junior manager, you get orders from above and you hand them on down below. And at the bottom, there are people who rent themselves to the place called workers. They don't have anything to say. Now, there's a little bit of feedback and interchange, but that was true even in Stalinist Russia. These are about as close to totalitarian as any institutions we know, and they're not small. By now, the top 500 corporations, Fortune 500, control about almost 2/3 of American gross domestic product and a very big piece of the world economy.
So you're in favor of using the term totalitarian to describe corporations. What about the F word? Could you effectively, or could you make an argument to say that they're really, to say there's little or no difference?
I tell you, I don't like to use the word fascist just because of its connotations.
Mm-hmm.
See, if we could go back to, say, the early 1940, and describe fascism as a socioeconomic and political system, okay, then it would be a system you could describe. But by now, fascism has it brings images of gas chambers and death camps and mass murder and so on. And of course, that's not true of these other institutions. I mean, maybe true of them, but it's not specifically true of these other institutions. So it's just kind of bringing the wrong imagery along with it. And it's become a kind of a word of abuse rather than a descriptive term. So probably better avoid it.
Okay. Moving on to unsustainable systems, it appears that one of the most serious threats to the survival of the human race is the effect fossil fuels is having on our atmosphere. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests certain crops grown for biomass and converted to methanol or ethanol through pyrolysis could replace fossil fuels, while at the same time these same crops convert the CO2 or the carbon dioxide back into oxygen and could help stop global warming, combined with a comprehensive energy conservation program. My question is, A, how important is the issue of global warming? And B, how does one force the evidence of alternatives to fossil fuels into the mass media, who themselves depend upon oil and car companies for their advertising revenue?
Well, I don't think anymore that there's very much doubt about the importance of global warming. In fact, at least you'll always find doubters, but the overwhelming scientific consensus is that it's a serious problem. You may have seen today's the 19th, yesterday, New York Times on the 18th had a front page story giving the early version of a draft report that's circulating from I think actually a couple of thousand scientists throughout the world, which is being presented to governments. And these are very mainstream people, major centrist. This is the real scientific establishment. And it said, yeah, there's a range of uncertainty and error, but there's very strong reason to believe that global warming is taking place and that fossil fuels are making a substantial contribution to it. And they estimate some of the anticipated effects over the next, 100 years or so, and they're fairly, with all the uncertainties, they're dangerous enough so that people are going to be very worried about it. This concern has been growing over the past several decades among serious scientists, and it's reached policymakers to an extent. It's reached the media to an extent. So, as I say, this was a front-page New York Times story. As to alternatives, that has to be looked at carefully. I mean, all alternatives, anything you think of has costs and benefits, and you got to look carefully at the costs and benefits. So there's two problems about alternatives. One is evaluating them, and the other is getting some information out about them. And the first is basically a technical problem, and the second is a socio-political problem, and it has the features you mentioned. So alternatives to fossil fuels are not going to be welcomed by power centers that rely on fossil fuels, and they're powerful. And the same is true much more generally of conservation. So, for example, the extensive use of automobiles instead of mass transportation. Again, you got to get the facts straight, but I think it's fairly clear that it's not only harmful to the environment, but it's probably harmful to human life. If people had a choice as to mass transportation, they'd often use it, I'm sure. They don't have a choice because policy has been devised to undermine mass transportation in favor of private use of automobiles. So one of the biggest social engineering projects probably in history was the suburbanization of America, which was a largely state-run policy costing hundreds of billions of dollars to try to replace railroads by roads and airplanes and move the populations out of the inner cities. It was done under the framework of defense. So it was called the National Defense Highway System and so on. But it was a straight state social engineering project, strongly supported, in fact, initiated by oil energy corporations and automobile corporations. And it had a massive effect on American life and American culture and everything else. And whether that's so the U.S. has some of the worst railroads in the world, and certainly in the developed world, and a huge use of automobiles, which are, it's whether this is you can't really claim this is consumer choice. There aren't many consumers who enjoy sitting around for 2 hours during the rush hour trying to get home in their own automobile. If they could get home fast by mass transportation, they would do that.
On an issue as important as global warming, do you think it's wise to call attention to the media's conflict of interest through, say, civil disobedience? Say, for example, Greenpeace decided to shut down offices of the New York Times until they printed a feature on how the media corporations were totally compromised by their dependence on unsustainable industries, and that this situation would inevitably result in the extinction of the human race. Would you go and testify on the protesters' behalf if they all got busted?
Yeah, I'm sure I would, but as to whether that would be independent of my own tactical judgment about it, whether it's a wise thing to do.
Right.
I've been involved in civil disobedience for many, many years,
Yeah.
and on my own, and I've often initiated things and certainly testified for others. But I, in my view, these are not moral questions. These are tactical. Well, they're not questions of principle. They're
Right.
questions of tactics, and it's usually questions of tactics that have moral significance, which you have to ask when you undertake civil disobedience, or for that matter, any other action, is what the consequences are.
Mm-hmm.
So, if civil disobedience has the consequence of increasing awareness and understanding and getting other people to try to do things that they might not otherwise have done, and so on, if that's its likely consequence, it's justified. If the likely consequence of civil disobedience is to build up opposition and antagonism and to strengthen power centers and so on, well, then it was the wrong tactic. And these are hard questions. I don't pretend to have any great insight into them, and my own tactical judgments have often been wrong over the years, but those are the questions you have to ask. There's no general answer.
Yeah, it seems to me the only way to answer those questions is to attempt it, and it also seems to me I haven't seen too many attempts at actual civil disobedience aimed at the media itself, perhaps fear of being ignored or shut out by the same media. But it seems like a worthwhile
it's worth
strategy.
thinking about, but you don't just attempt it, you think about it.
Yeah.
For one thing, a general point about any kind of civil disobedience, at least in my opinion, is that you want to make sure that people are going to understand it the way you want them to understand it, not the way it's going to be presented by somebody else. And that means a lot of preparatory work.
Right. Okay, moving on from the depressing prospects of our unsustainable society and its internally flawed communication system, I'd like to ask you about attempts at more sustainable societies, for example, Spain, during the Spanish Civil War. How did decisions manage to be made by sizable portions of the population without politicians and employers to make them?
Well, this was not a very long experiment. It lasted about a year before it was smashed, mostly by the communists, I should say, with the backing of the West and the fascists. But there's a considerable record, and it's worth looking at. And it varied all over the place. It had a very varied forms. In Catalonia, which was a fairly industrialized area, the industrial centers were, to a substantial extent, run by workers' committees, and apparently pretty effectively. Throughout large areas like Aragon, there were hundreds of collectives of varying sorts, some extremely poor, some fairly well off. They developed, again, mostly local committees in one or another form. Federations were set up among them. There's a pretty general agreement, even by people who are hostile, that they were reasonably successful economically under very harsh conditions. And they certainly had a lot of enormous amount of popular support. That's why such violence was needed in order to destroy them. There's a lot of documents from the collectives themselves. For a long time, they were only in Spanish and French. I wrote about this about, 35 years ago, I guess. And then I could only use the original documents, which I'd picked up when I was a kid at the time, in around 1940. But by now, the documents have been published, even in English. There's a book on workers' collectives in Spain, which is just documents from the collectives themselves, edited by Sam Dalgoff a couple of years ago. And there's a pretty good literature on it from many points of view. A lot of people think it was terrible. A lot of people like it. But a lot of different things were tried. They were basically participatory and peasant and worker committees of one sort or another, with federal structures being evolved. But it was in the midst of a war, and a lot of the anarchist leadership just joined the government, either for power reasons or because they felt it was necessary to fight the war first, which led to lots of conflict. Many of the anarchist writers, like Vernon Richards is a famous one, British anarchist, were bitterly critical of this right at the beginning and said it would destroy the revolution. And, can go on and on, but complicated period, and it's hard to know whether it proves that a more democratic society could run, but it's interesting evidence. It's probably the major example of an anarchist success.
Right. So would you go so far as to say that one of the important mistakes we learned, or we could learn from the Spanish Civil War, was not to give up the bottom-up decision-making structures when you need or feel the need for more efficiency?
Well, I don't think that more efficiency was the issue, because they were pretty efficient. The question was defense against fascism. The question was, do we fight the war or do we fight the revolution? That was the real question that people were facing. And one point of view was, well, you fight the war by fighting the revolution. So one of the leading anarchists, who was in fact murdered probably by the communists, an Italian anarchist, Camillo Berneri, who was in Spain, his position, which I thought was pretty sensible, frankly, although a lot of others don't, was that the way to fight the war against Franco was not by relying on Russia and big armies and so on and so forth, but rather by a guerrilla struggle in Spain and a political struggle in North Africa. Now that was quite crucial because Franco's armies were brought over from North Africa. They were Moroccan mercenaries to a large extent. And Berneri's idea was that the Spanish left should try to make common cause with these very people who were fighting against colonialism in their own countries. Remember, North Africa was colonized at that time. And indeed, the leader of the North African guerrilla movements, Abd el-Krim, who had only recently been suppressed, he in fact even offered to start up guerrilla activities behind the Franco lines in North Africa, which might well have undermined the Franco armies. You know, these are, after all, people. They might want to fight for land reform and justice in their own societies instead of attacking Spain. Well, that was, I think, not an implausible suggestion. It never got to first base because the communists, who were pretty dominant, their main interest, they were following Stalin's orders, was to create good relations with the West. They were interested in Russia's relations with the West. They hated the Spanish Revolution like poison, and they certainly didn't care much about the Spanish Civil War, except insofar as it had to do with Russia's foreign relations. And they knew perfectly well that the West would go berserk if there were revolutions initiated in North Africa and the British and French colonies. So that was suppressed. But from the point of view of winning the war, it might have been the right way to do it. So fighting the war and fighting the revolution are not necessarily opposing choices, but they're complicated choices, and I don't think one can be glib about it.
No.
It's easy to talk from here. They were right in the middle of it.
Yeah, we have the opportunity.
Now we can sort of say, yeah, here's what you should have done, but
Yeah.
When you got people shooting at you, you don't have those choices.
No doubt. Jumping ahead 30 years to the 60s, could you discuss briefly the events of May 1968 in Paris? What happened, and what was the decision-making structure they adopted anarchist or libertarian socialist in nature?
Well, it was so brief and so quirky that it's kind of hard to judge. I have to tell you, frankly, at the time I was not all that excited about it. I mean, there was something good about it. There were efforts by workers and by students to sort of, take control of their own affairs, and that part's to the good. But there was an awful lot of play acting, in my opinion, and posturing, and it was suppressed very quickly with the assistance of the Communist Party, as usual. So it's kind of hard to say. I mean, it had a kind of a socio-cultural effect, but maybe my judgment was wrong, I don't know. But my own judgment was I wasn't all that excited about all the 68 events, that was kind of like the freaky side of the movement in many ways. Had good features, but I thought a lot of negative ones too.
I'm not familiar with the negative side. From what I understand, the students had gathered together and attempted a form of collective decision-making, whereas anybody could address
Yeah, that part's nice, but
Yeah.
it was a lot of it was very personalized. You know, let's make love and smoke pot and listen to music and everybody will be happy. Well, that's not the way things work. No, that's a caricature.
It lacked a work ethic.
Hmm?
In other words,
Work ethic is a very serious matter. I mean, I'm not opposed to the work ethic. In fact, I think here I disagree with a lot of people. But in my view, one of the most wonderful things in a person's life is the opportunity to do constructive, creative work.
Right.
Here I really go along with classical liberalism, which held that a person's basic needs are to inquire and create and discover and produce on your own terms, of course, not under order, not under command, but out of your own initiative. So I think that all of that, I think that's great. If people had a chance to work, I think they'd love it.
Right.
The work means something you do out of love, not out of need or under command.
But it was too mixed up with
there was
the
a lot
exaltation of personal freedom.
Personal self-indulgence.
Mm.
That was a large part of it. I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, it was a very mixed and complicated thing with many different aspects. Some of which I thought were okay, some not, and it was over so fast. It was, it's hard to make a judgment about it.
Okay. Jumping ahead, another open microphones at demonstrations and rallies where participants and even opponents can address the group. Does it add to the democratic nature of the structure? Does it interfere with the efficiency, as some, I guess, communists would like to argue? What's your perspective on open microphones?
Well, in general, I'm in favor of it, but that's a general principle, and you really have to judge the cases. I mean, if having open microphones if the circumstances are such that open microphones do nothing but cause everything to collapse so that people cannot do what they want, which, remember, there's conflicting commitments. On the one hand, there's a common effort to act with solidarity and mutual support and so on to achieve some result. On the other hand, there's an interest in the value of allowing the freest individual expression, and those are not always consistent with one another. Human life is a complicated affair. We can hold various values, and they're not always consistent, and we have to make choices between them. And it's kind of like the question of civil disobedience. I don't think you can give a general answer. You have to make judgments based on the circumstances and how the values that you uphold can be maximized under given circumstances, and often with conflicts, because they're often in conflict.
Okay, well, let's say there's a general attitude within the participants itself, and then there's been discussion that says at a particular moment an open mic would not be a good thing. Are there any other curbs on power that could maintain the democratic nature of the demonstration, rally, or community, while at the same time, not having an open microphone? Are there any other curbs on power? Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, I mean, for example, if suppose there's a demonstration, and suppose some group is trying to disrupt it by violence,
right?
And suppose you stop them. Well, that's a use of power.
I'm more concerned with a curb on power on perhaps the steering committees that seem to evolve and make decisions in their own interest rather than in the interest of their constituents.
It often can be. On the other hand, sometimes power is democratically delegated on the condition of recall.
Yeah.
And
almost instant recall.
I don't think that there can be a general answer to this.
No.
You're quite right in pointing to the fact that steering committees and coordinators have a kind of an institutional drive to amass more power to themselves, and that you've got to watch out for.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's not to say you should never delegate authority to do anything.
No.
If we did that, we'd be, just totally incapable of acting at all.
Right.
So you make choices and decisions.
Right.
Life doesn't have simple solutions.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. In the film Manufacturing Consent, There's some old TV footage with you debating William F. Buckley Jr. on Firing Line, his television program. Buckley is apparently holding a button in his hand, and whenever his argument becomes weak, he presses the button and the network cuts to a commercial.
Yeah, I noticed that while I was on.
I bet. If there were no commercials and he didn't have the button to hide behind, could he defend his right-wing opinions?
No, I'm not the one to pass judgment on that.
Well, okay.
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, yes, in a way.
But
I mean, I think you can defend almost anything if you're slick enough and there's not enough time and you know debaters' tricks and so on.
Right.
I mean, there's virtually nothing that you couldn't. That's. I mean, take say debating.
Right.
You know, which I think is one of the dumbest human activities there is. But formal debating.
Okay.
Well, you know, in formal debating, good debating teams are trained to take both sides of an argument. Right? That's what a formal debate is. You're supposed to be able to defend both sides of the argument. And I don't think it's very hard to do. You know, within a controlled format, there's almost nothing you can't defend with the right sort of tricks and with you don't have to present that much evidence, and you know, you can say things that there's no way to challenge, and so on and so forth. So yeah, sure, you can probably defend anything in a brief span of time with enough limitations on how far you can go.
But let's say you created, or the community created, an accessible, level playing field debate-style television program with enough time, like 2 or 3 hours, to go into the issues in depth.
Yeah.
Could that serve as a cornerstone, in effect, of a direct democracy?
Sure, I think that'd be terrific. And so anyway, I would question the debate style, however.
Well, okay, not debate.
There's something phony about the idea of debates. I mean, a debate is based on the principle that you don't change your mind. Like if you and I were to have a debate, that would mean I stand up for X and you stand up for not X, and we're not allowed to change our minds. Like in a debate, I'm not allowed to say, hey, that was a good point. I think maybe you're right. I'll change my mind about that. You're not allowed to do that in a debate. What you have to do is hold on to your position no matter what. And that's just irrational.
Right, so perhaps a talk show or something.
Discussions make sense.
Larry King, in effect.
Well, discussions make sense.
Yeah.
And sure, the freer they are and the broader they are and the more views get expressed and the more opportunities there are to pursue things in some depth, better it is.
Right.
But you have to be able to pursue them. You know, one of the standard tricks of American media, they've even invented a word for it. I didn't know this until a couple of years ago when I heard it from the producer of Nightline, I think. But they have a word called concision, which I'd never heard before, but it means just what you'd expect, that things have to be concise. You're only allowed on if you can meet the condition of concision, meaning make short, snappy statements, you know, between two commercials, basically. Well, that's a terrific technique for thought control. I presume that's why it's been developed. I mean, if you have to say short, snappy things, you can only repeat things everybody agrees with. Try to say something that's a little bit controversial, and people have a right to ask you, what do you mean by that? And then comes, thank you, Mr. So-and-so, you know.
Yeah, newspapers are adopting
the newspapers are saying
the concision thing while they're downsizing or shrinking their...
You know, at best, they're very, very limited.
Yeah.
It's very rare to see a 2,000-word article in a newspaper. But here, I mean, it's quite different. You know, this country, the United States, is a little different than other countries in this respect, though they're going our way. But these conditions, especially in the popular media, in the radio and television, are extreme, and in the newspapers quite a lot. They are just techniques of thought control alongside of restricting the range of things.
Okay. What would happen to people like, let's say, Henry Kissinger or George Bush in a direct democracy? Would the world vote to have them executed as dangerous psychopaths, or would we place them under surveillance?
Well, I'm against the death penalty myself, so I would not be in favor of executing them. But dangerous psychopaths, I don't know. I mean, my suspicion is that they would sort of drift into the margins and be insignificant in a free society.
Yeah. How would you deal with, let's say, the anger of Panamanians or some Chileans or some of the people who's been bombed and had their children taken away from them? How would you argue to let our masters continue on, live or serve some sort of penance for their
Well,
obvious
this is like
crimes.
asking, should there be international war crimes trials?
Yeah.
Like right now, there are international war crimes tribunals going on for Serbians. That's reasonable. I think there shouldn't be impunity for crimes, but it's also deeply dishonest because we don't subject our own war criminals to the same conditions, and if we're at all serious, we should. So take, say, Henry Kissinger. I mean, he's got a list of war crimes a mile long. And if we're going to say, yes, there shouldn't be impunity, then fine, let's not have impunity. Let's start at home where we don't have to go capture the people.
Right. Now, is there a conscious fear among elites, echoes of the guillotine, which prevents them from...
No, it's not that. They won't even consider it.
No.
Take, say, the this is a deeply indoctrinated society.
Yeah.
Take, say, the Vietnam War.
Right.
I mean, that led to about 4 million people killed. That's fairly impressive, even by 20th century standards. 3 countries totally ruined. I mean, forget about punishment. Have you ever heard an apology for it? Did anybody apologize for the Vietnam War? No, it's inconceivable. The United States doesn't make apologies. We beat people up. We don't apologize. McNamara just wrote a book, which is kind of interesting, that just at the time that McNamara's book was all over the front page, big, right before that, David Hackworth, who's the most decorated American veteran, as you may know, a famous military officer who fought in Vietnam. He fought in the Mekong Delta in the South. He went back to visit the battlegrounds where he fought, and he went to the villages of where he had fought, and he met the commanders, those who were still alive, and the combatants on the other side, South Vietnamese. And he wrote a very interesting article in Newsweek. Very interesting, very humane, very simple, straightforward, honorable, honest. I mean, kind of a different galaxy from the stuff that you read about in the among respectable, educated intellectuals. Just a different world from McNamara. I mean, first of all, he understood that he was fighting South Vietnamese. McNamara never seems to have been able to get himself to understand that. He knows that he was fighting a war against the South Vietnamese. He speaks of his great respect for the South Vietnamese commanders, the so-called Viet Cong, who he met with and who, made friends with one another after having fought bitterly. He describes going to what he calls the center of the revolution, a place where he fought. He was with the 9th Division, which is very brutal, incidentally. And he describes the village that this guy lives. I don't know, this village of 75,000 people. Most of them were killed. All of his family were killed. He describes his great respect for the combatants on the other side and his utter contempt for the leaders in the United States who thought that they could destroy people's struggle for independence with bombs. Well, that's a different moral universe from the one you get, and I was surprised to see it in Newsweek, but it's a different moral universe from the one that dominates discussion here. We don't concede, respectable people here don't concede that we did anything wrong or could do anything wrong. In fact, even more amazing, it's the Vietnamese who are guilty. The moral issue remaining from the war is what they did to us, not what we did to them. I mean, that's pretty astonishing. I don't know if there's a historical analog to this.
Let's say you or somebody successfully managed to force evidence of perhaps the U.S. bombing of South Vietnam onto the front page of the New York Times, and there was a great uproar about that.
Should there be war crimes?
Well, after the War Crimes Tribunal. So, as I don't know how exactly to put this, but to offer to cooperate with those who have committed these crimes on our behalf.
Can we commit them on my behalf?
Well, not on my behalf either. I wasn't alive at the time, but
they certainly didn't commit them on behalf of. They didn't commit them on behalf of David Hackworth. He's the first to tell you that. Nor did they commit them on behalf of the great majority of the American people who were opposed to it.
Yeah.
They committed them on the behalf of the people they serve and the power interests they serve, not us.
But you also say that the public has a very serious burden of guilt in that we stand by and allow.
But I blame myself too.
Yeah.
No, I'm not blaming other people.
No. But I'm saying in terms of our collective guilt, could we possibly offer, penance or
Sure,
some
we
sort
ought
of
to pay
purgatory
reparations.
rather?
Look, we ought to pay reparations.
Yeah.
I mean, Germany pays reparations to Jews.
Yeah.
No reason why we shouldn't pay reparations to Vietnamese and Nicaraguans and Guatemalans and Chileans and quite a lot of others.
Yeah. I guess my question is, can we offer something to those who presently hold power, to just as a way out without them dying and us dying? In that, look, if you hand power over to people in general, in communities, and collective decision-making, bottom-up decision-making, we won't turn around and put you to death for your crimes. We'll just say that everybody...
They should not have a choice. A democratic revolution does not ask rulers to please give up power and then we'll be nice to you.
No.
What it says is, look, it's a value to democratize, and we're going to take power,
right?
And you can just be among us, period.
But
that's your choice.
Right before we take power, is it possible to avoid some bloodshed by...
I don't know. It depends whether people with power resist the democracy.
Right.
That's the decision about violence is in the hands of those with power.
Yes.
I mean, look, any revolutionary who's even got his head screwed on would rather have it be peaceful.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I mean, if people won't abandon their own privilege and power without violence, well, okay, you defend yourself.
Right, right. Moving to an sort of an abstract question, not quite, you can speculate on the answers to this, but Gerard Winstanley, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, of the Diggers, the early Democrats in England, once speculated that the ability to reason was the kingdom of God within man. And Gandhi said something to the same effect, that God is reason, or something like that. Would it be possible to offer reason as a replacement for the list of do's and don'ts that most organized religions have to offer? Or are human beings too comfortable or too superstitious or too isolated to assume responsibility for their actions and adopt reason as a basis for decision-making rather than what God tells you to do?
Well, look, I'm personally like a child of the Enlightenment. I'm all in favor of being as reasonable as we can and not simply accepting arbitrary authoritarian doctrines from wherever they come. Notice, remember, God doesn't tell you to do anything. People do.
Yeah.
They may say they're talking in the name of God, but God doesn't talk to people. So what is called God's commandments is people's commandments that are assigned to God as an authority. And I don't see any reason to follow any arbitrary commandment. Now, on the other hand, even the most devoted, the people most devoted to reason recognized something which is true. And we should recognize it too. It was put rather well by one major Enlightenment figure, David Hume, who pointed out that reason is the slave of the passions, meaning we can reason, but we reason within our framework of instincts and desires and hopes and concerns and so on. We can try to analyze them, and we should be willing to evaluate them and question them, but we can't get rid of them. They're there. And reason is an instrument with limited power that operates within a framework of other dominant factors that we should try to understand, but we cannot extricate ourselves from. So it's not that reason is like a universal instrument that can solve every problem. It can't. There are very few things that we know how to reason about seriously. We don't understand much. It's important to remember that not much is understood. I mean, even in the natural sciences, when you get beyond, say, big molecules, understanding drops off pretty fast. When you get to questions of human interest and concern, how should people relate to one another, or how should children be brought up, or what should societies be like, and so on, we're operating mostly on the basis of intuition and instinct and experience and judgment, and one should try to be as reasonable as one can, and should always be ready to question dogma, but also have an honest understanding of the limits of our understanding, which are considerable.
Okay, we're getting to just about the end of our time. I was wondering if I could ask you a couple of informal questions and then ask you for a station identification for our fund drive here.
Yeah.
Okay. The informal questions are, have you ever heard of the television program TV Nation at all?
Nope, but I don't know much about
Television.
I'm kind of out of the popular culture.
Right. There was a bunch of us wondering if let's say a contemporary film director such as Oliver Stone or Spike Lee approached you and asked you to serve as a consultant for a major motion picture on, say, the bombing of South Vietnam or Angola, in Spike Lee's case. Would you be interested in doing anything like that?
Acting as a consultant. Sure, if I know anything that could be useful, I'll be glad to help anybody.
Right, because that amount of exposure, I mean, there are video stores in small 200 people towns in Mexico, so it would reach.
No, I'm all in favor of people doing that kind of thing. It's just that I'm no good at it. So,
Well,
in fact, I think it's terrifically important. Just not my kind of thing.
Well, you are a very important resource for that sort of activity.
Yeah, if I could help, I mean, I often do, in fact, but if I can, sure, I'd be glad to.
Okay. Well, then, thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, for your time. And if you could, if you could just say hi. This is Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, give me the details. What's the?
Well, we're just every year we.
No, I mean what's the?
All you have to say is.
I don't even know the name of the station.
Oh, it's CJSR in Edmonton. CJSR.
S like in sister.
Yeah. S.
CJSR.
In Edmonton.
In Edmonton.
Yeah, and that public radio needs to be supported,
This
etc.
is public. It's a public radio.
It's a community. It's a university/volunteer community radio station. Everybody has access to it. So.
Okay. You want me to just say something?
Yeah.
Okay. This is Noam Chomsky speaking. I've just completed a very interesting for me interview on CJSR and would like to ask people to do what they can to support public radio, volunteer stations in Edmonton and everywhere. It's a major factor in breaking through the authoritarian structures of our society and making it a more free and democratic place for all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and carry on with your good work.
Okay, good luck to you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Talk to you later.
Good to talk to you. Yep.
Bye.
Bye.